Now, to the second topic. I recently spent 5 days in the Middle East last week. I came back just before this recent spat of violence began in Gaza and Israel. During the 5 days that I was in the Middle East, I crossed paths with a bunch of Biden officials that were making stops throughout the region, and I can report that setting aside the conflict in Israel, something that's pretty hard to do right now, there is some real positive news to bring back from the Gulf. The 4-year-long rift between Qatar and its Gulf neighbors is healing. There's now a new diplomatic energy behind ceasefire talks in Yemen, and the Saudis and the Iranians are in direct talks for the first time in years. All of this, I was repeatedly told by leaders in the Middle East, is happening because President Biden has made clear that de-escalation is going to be rewarded and supported by the United States, a stark departure from the Trump administration. Now, this is good news, but the bad news quickly follows. And it's this: if the United States does not re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement, all of this nascent progress is going to be at risk. Joe Biden ran on a promise to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement. He made this commitment because he knew that this agreement was critical to American security. With Iran's nuclear program curtailed and inspectors allowed to comb every inch of the country to look for signs of a secret enrichment program, the world could breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that for all of Iran's other malevolent behaviors and policies, at least we knew that they weren't developing a nuclear weapon. The achievement of the deal also brought together a set of really unlikely bedfellows: the United States, Europe, but also Russia and China. And on Iran policy, this coalition of regular adversaries, it was intact at the end of the Obama administration. It was ready to be picked up by President Trump to confront Iran's ballistic missile program or the support for regional proxy forces like Hezbollah. But Trump went in a different direction. Instead of building on the Iran deal, he decided to put to test the theory of its opponents. That theory is this: that if the United States imposed unilateral, crippling sanctions on Iran, leaders in Tehran would limp to the negotiating table, cowed and willing to put all the issues, nuclear enrichment, missiles, human rights, proxy support, up for discussion. That's what Obama's critics said he should have done. And those critics cheered when Trump took their advice. What happened, of course, was a policy cataclysm. Trump imposed the sanctions, and our partners, instead of following America's lead, effectively took the Iranian side, even helping Iran work around our sanctions. Making matters worse, when Trump sent word to the Iranians of our 12 demands, they refused to talk. Instead, they did the opposite. They ratcheted up their bad behavior. They sent more support to the Houthis in Yemen. They restarted dormant parts of their nuclear program, reducing their breakout time to a weapon from just over a year to just under 3 months. And they resumed attacks on American forces in the region, both directly and through proxies. Here's a pretty simple way to take a look at the success of the maximum pressure campaign. One element of the Iran nuclear deal was a commitment by Iran to reduce their enriched uranium stockpile. You can see in the years leading up to the deal, there is a dramatic escalation in the amount of enriched uranium that the Iranians are holding. And then immediately upon the deal being reached, it plummets. But here's the bad news. As soon as the maximum pressure campaign is unveiled by President Trump, those numbers start to creep back up again. One chart explains to you the effect of Trump's maximum pressure campaign. It was a spectacular failure and definitive proof that the alternative approach cheered by the Iran deal's opponents, keep the sanctions in place until Iran totally capitulates, was a fantasy. Instead, the situation has empowered the more hardline wing of an already hardline regime who are prepared to perpetually operate a resistance economy and blame the United States for the nation's suffering. But now, those same critics of the nuclear agreement are back. And incredibly, despite the writing inked on the wall during the past 4 years, their argument hasn't changed a bit. Just keep doing what Trump did. And this time it will work, they say. They suggest that getting back into the nuclear deal, as Biden pledged during the campaign, isn't enough. They want a new deal that includes a resolution to all of Iran's bad acts. But unless we're prepared to invade Iran and demand unconditional surrender, and newsflash, we're not, then that comprehensive soup-to-nuts deal is a neoconservative fantasy. It doesn't exist in real life. In real life, the achievable result is a restart of the nuclear agreement. But the good news is that this result in 2021 might have an even greater peace dividend than when it was executed the first time in 2015. And so this brings me back to my trip to the region. I heard the story while I was there of how quickly talks on healing the Gulf Cooperation Council rift matured as soon as Biden won the election. Countries that were at each other's throats throughout the Trump administration were suddenly coming to terms with each other. The reason was simple. While conflict and bullying and score settling, Trump's calling cards, were rewarded during his term, countries quickly realized that diplomacy and de-escalation would most quickly win favor with President Biden. In Oman, I heard how the Saudis were suddenly much more willing to make concessions in Yemen, and how the Houthis were now more likely to trust the U.S. as an interlocutor. In Jordan, the king talked to us about how an Iraqi government was now more welcoming than ever of help from places other than Iran. And he spoke of Jordan's new overtures to a Baghdad government looking for a more diverse set of allies. And everyone in the region at every stop buzzed about these talks, these dialogue between the Saudis and the Iranians. Reports suggested that these two countries wanted to talk during the Trump administration, but were discouraged from doing so. And so this momentum towards peace is encouraging, but it is so fragile. And one major setback, one major unexpected diplomatic hiccup could turn all this progress around. I worry that this hiccup could be the failure of America and Iran to get back into the nuclear agreement. If the talks fail and the Biden administration is forced to implement Trump's Iran policy for the next 4 years, complete with these unilateral crippling sanctions, it's easy to see how all of this progress in the Gulf could disintegrate. The so-called Iranian moderates would head back to Tehran with no deal and be defeated in the upcoming national elections. A harder-line government, much less prone to diplomacy, would choose to scuttle peace talks in Yemen, end the outreach to the Saudis, work like mad to make sure that their proxies in Iraq take power in the upcoming parliamentary elections. This could convince the Saudis to double down militarily in Yemen and open up new fissures in the Gulf. Listen, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is an overly apocalyptic vision of what would occur if the nuclear negotiations go south, but I fear that it is more accurate than fantastical. The stakes might be that high. Which brings me finally to our negotiations in Vienna. If the consequences of success are so promising and the ramifications of failure are so dire, then what's got to happen to guarantee a good outcome? And I'll end here. First, the structure of the talks is deeply problematic, and that's the Iranians' fault. They're insisting on this shuttle diplomacy. We should be talking directly to them. Second, countries in Iran's neighborhood who were hostile or neutral to the talks in 2015, they suddenly have their eyes wide open to the benefits of getting back into the deal, and so we should make sure that our partners in the Middle East who have the ear of the Iranian government or the supreme leader, we should make sure that they're applying the appropriate pressure and that they should let Iran know that their relationships in the region are at risk if Iran fails to get back into the deal. But on our side of the ledger, we need to be willing to be creative. Now, of course, any restart of the nuclear agreement is going to require the United States to drop the sanctions Trump applied to Iran's economy that have the same impact as the Obama-era nuclear sanctions. But here's the point I want to make. What about the other sanctions that Trump layered on top of the economic sanctions? For example, it should be expected that the Iranians would want us to lift Trump's designation of its primary military force, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. This wasn't strictly a nuclear sanction, but it was certainly a key part of Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and it was specifically designed to try to bring Iran back to the negotiating table on their nuclear program. In evaluating the wisdom of peeling back these non-economic sanctions, it's important to remember that they were all completely feckless. These sanctions had no impact. In fact, their only impact was to worsen Iran's behavior. So lifting them, it would have no practical negative impact. Just as importantly, lifting this particular designation, the one example I'm posing to you today, It's a rather technical exercise under the U.S. statute, and it actually doesn't prevent us from sanctioning the truly bad actors in the Iranian military. For example, our sanctions on some of their most brutal interrogators, the IRGC's interrogators, they'd all stay in place, even if we lifted that blanket IRGC designation. So this is just one example of a Trump-era sanction whose erasure would have little to no practical impact, and there are many more. But I use this example to show how weighing the equities, the benefits of getting back into the deal are going to be far greater than the imaginary benefits of keeping many of Trump's non-economic sanctions. Now, let me be clear. If these sanctions like this are removed, opponents of the deal are going to cry bloody murder. They're going to accuse Biden of giving more than Obama gave. But this is the exact trap that Trump was trying to set for his successor. He applied sanctions on Iran in connection with the pullout of the nuclear deal, but called them non-nuclear sanctions, hoping the next president would be caught in this sticky web. President Biden shouldn't be bound by Trump's tortured sanctions logic. But just as importantly, let me assure you that no matter the particulars or the details of the agreement to restart the nuclear deal, the deal critics are going to oppose it no matter what. They opposed it in 2015. They're going to oppose it again. What we should really be worried about is Trump's Iran policy becoming, by accident, permanent. And this is what is likely to occur if the Vienna talks fail. Iran will continue to speed up its nuclear research program, maximum pressure will continue, and a chill will be delivered to the de-escalation momentum in the region. But on the other hand, re-entering the deal, while effectively already priced into a Biden electoral victory, it will be seen as a diplomatic victory at a perfect time to score a win for diplomacy. And the Middle East countries who have found new affection for a U.S.-Iran agreement will exhale. Now, I'm not naive. I understand the Middle East has still dozens of intractable crises, and the events of the last few days in Israel and Gaza are a reminder of the grave challenges that are still there. But the overall mood of de-escalation in and around the Gulf, it is real. And it's much better than the old incentive structure for escalation. So I see these roots of positive change slowly, quietly growing. And right now, the best way for the United States to nurture those grass shoots is to restart the Iran nuclear agreement. I yield back.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.